A standard galactic trial usually involved three things: a verified data slate, a sealed memory extract, and a verdict delivered so quickly the accused barely had time to understand the charges because the galactic legal system didn't do theater, didn't do ambiguity, and didn't do the messy internal weather of emotion. It did precedent, it did consistency, it did outcomes that snapped into place like magnetized plates, and nowhere embodied that cold certainty more than the pillar court of Tethys Prime, a black crystal spire threaded with light and humming logic, where High Arbiter Kazori Ven presided from a dais that looked less like a bench and more like the crown of an ancient machine, while clerks like Saul Veer tracked every motion with precise ocular flickers and every claim with time-stamped registry seals. The Concord had built an interstellar civilization on the belief that truth was objective, that justice could be automated, and that if you could define every act with sufficient specificity, you could banish chaos permanently. Yet when humanity arrived, through diplomacy rather than conquest, through petitions rather than intimidation, their very request sounded like a paradox spoken aloud. Ambassador Elias Rourke asked not merely for protection under Concord law, but for full legal standing, the right to contest, appeal, argue, and be heard. And when the gate clerks asked what humans wanted in practical terms, Rourke smiled like a man who knew he was about to irritate a god, and said they wanted the right to be wrong and still be judged fairly. A phrase that made the Concord's legal engines pause, because to them, fair was a function of correct procedure, while to humans, fair was a living animal that could bite you if you treated it as a number. Rourke brought with him not weapons, but concepts, burden of proof, counsel, cross-examination, the presumption of innocence, and the Concord accepted the treaty because they believed they could absorb anything into their logic if given enough time, not realizing humanity didn't get absorbed, humanity rewired. And the first rewiring began with a case so trivial the court scheduled it between tariff adjudications and orbital boundary disputes, a minor salvage violation in Sector E-17, a small, neat charge that should have ended in minutes until the defendant walked into the ring and the galaxy met its first truly human problem. Not a human warship, not a human engine, not a human bomb, but a human refusal to accept that law and justice were the same word. The defendant's name was Jonah Red, captain of the salvage-capable civilian vessel Wayfarer 9, and the prosecution advocate, Proctor Lex Naru, presented the case with the sterile calm of someone reciting Gravity. Jonah's crew had docked with the wrecked courier vessel VSH 771, extracted cargo, and departed while a registered salvage claim, held by the corporation Mendicant Clade Holdings, remained active, an interference with registered rights that Concord law categorized as theft. And the memory extract on the court's hollow surface was as clean as a scalpel. Timestamps, hull IDs, approach vectors, docking clamps, cargo transfer, departure, no missing frames, no distortions, no room for the kind of fog humans use to hide in. Kazori Ven looked down at Jonah and asked the ritual question, "Do you contest the recorded act?" And Jonah said simply, "I didn't steal anything." A statement that in the Concord tongue didn't just sound false, it sounded senseless, because the act was recorded, and recorded acts were truth. Naru's gaze tightened as he replied that Jonah was captured extracting cargo, therefore Jonah stole it, and Jonah said, "No, I rescued it." And the High Arbiter's tendrils shifted slightly, the faintest sign of irritation, because rescue was a distinct legal category with its own procedures, and Jonah's extraction had not been registered as rescue. "Explain distinction," Kazori then demanded, and Jonah's voice dropped like he was trying not to explode in a building that punished explosions with silence. There were people in cryo, he said, and the court froze, not with empathy, but with processing delay, because VSH 771's registry declared no living persons aboard. And when Naru answered that unregistered life had no legal claim, Jonah laughed, one sharp bark of disbelief that sounded almost like pain, then stared straight at the prosecution and asked if paperwork was how the Concord decided who counted as alive. And Kazori then warned Jonah that he was here to answer for breach, not to evaluate the system. But Jonah swallowed hard and said he wasn't evaluating it, he was telling them why he did it. And that would have been the end of the defendant's outburst if the courtroom doors hadn't opened to admit the second human in the story, Mara Voss, legal counsel, whose stride carried the casual confidence of someone who spent years wrestling monsters made of rules and winning, who looked at the pillar court's pristine symmetry and smiled as if she'd just been handed a stage.
Mara stepped into the defense circle beside Jonah and said, "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty." And the phrase itself was an irritant to the Concord, because their defendants rarely pleaded anything. Evidence either matched or it didn't, and guilt was a function of alignment between act and statute. So Proctor Lex Naharu asked, sharp and clipped, what her function was, and Mara replied, without apology, that her function was to prevent the state from ruining an innocent man's life because it couldn't imagine being wrong. She turned her attention to the machinery of the trial and began asking questions the Concord considered defective, starting with the one that made the clerks twitch. "Do you recognize the concept of reasonable doubt?" Kazori then told her to define it, and Mara explained that if a plausible explanation for innocence exists and the prosecution cannot eliminate it, you don't convict. And Naharu countered that uncertainty implied further investigation, not acquittal. And Mara nodded as if he'd said something adorable and dangerous, and replied, "Yes, exactly. So investigate, but don't punish while you're uncertain." And Kazori then observed that her standard was emotional, not logical. And Mara corrected him in a tone that cut deeper because it carried no anger, only clarity. "It's human," she said, and that word hung in the air like a new element the Concord hadn't cataloged. Then Mara performed a trick that was less theatrical than it seemed, because it wasn't designed to impress the court. It was designed to force the court to admit it didn't know something. "My client pleads the fifth," she said, and the high arbiter paused long enough to ask, baffled, "The fifth what?" while Naharu snapped that human amendments were irrelevant, and Mara smiled and said it wasn't about human law being transplanted. It was about human instinct showing up in the courtroom anyway, the refusal to self-incriminate under ambiguous authority, the deep evolutionary suspicion that power does not deserve your confession just because it demands one. And even if the Concord could ignore the phrase, it could not ignore what came next, because Mara didn't argue the recording. She argued the frame around the recording, and the frame was where she intended to break them. Naharu presented the memory extract again, concluding that the act was recorded, the claim was registered, therefore the crime was proven. And Kazori then invited the defense response with the bored certainty of an equation reaching its result. But Mara held up one finger and asked a question so simple it sounded almost polite. "Where's the rest of it?" Naharu said what the Concord always said, that was the relevant section. And Mara turned slightly toward the judge and said, "That's a choice," requesting full context of the extraction timeline. And Kazori then granted it because Concord law valued completeness, even when it didn't value nuance. And as the playback expanded, the clean theft narrative began to rot from the inside. Jonah's crew cut through twisted plating, entered compartments black with drifting dust, moved deeper, and then Jonah stopped so suddenly his suit lights trembled because he'd found the cryo chamber. Rows of pods with faint pulses like trapped stars, unlisted, unregistered, invisible to legal reality. And Jonah's suit mic caught his voice cracking with fury. "Holy, there are people in here!" and Sanamirek, his crewmate, warned him that the salvage claim said no life aboard, and Jonah snarled, "Then the claim's wrong," a statement that wasn't legal argument, but moral arithmetic. And he began ripping pods free with his own hands, tearing cables, levering frozen bodies from their metal cradles, like a man trying to steal people back from the void. Then Jonah transmitted a rescue distress code to Concord emergency channels, and the court watched its own system reject the plea with machine indifference. Unregistered life form cargo, claim conflict. In the pillar court, there was no gasp, no outrage, no hand over mouth, but there was something worse, a pause, a subtle stutter in the courthouse's confidence, because the evidence had just shown that the Concord's perfect law had not merely failed to help, it had actively blocked a rescue because the victims weren't on the paperwork. And Mara let the silence thicken before she spoke, calmly turning her voice into a scalpel. "So let me get this straight," she said, facing the prosecution. "My client finds living beings trapped in a wreck, requests rescue clearance, and your system denies him because they don't exist in your registry." And then she faced the judge and asked without raising her tone, "And you want to convict him for theft?" And Naharu said rigidly, "Law is law." And Mara stepped forward and replied, "Then explain why your law tried to murder them." And for the first time, the court confronted a problem it had no statute for. What happens when obedience is the crime and disobedience is the only path to saving life?
On the second cycle of hearings, the prosecution began to show irritation, not rage, but the faint tightening of a being whose worldview was under threat. And that tightening itself was a kind of psychological panic, because the Concord treated emotion as contamination, and Mara was forcing it into the room like smoke. Naru accused Mara of relying on sentiment, asserting the system could not operate on sentiment, and Mara's expression softened into something far more dangerous than anger, because it made her look like she was teaching, and teaching is what predators do when they're confident their prey can't run. "Do you know what humans did before we had courts like this?" she asked, and Naru replied that humanity engaged in prolonged violence, and Mara agreed and said humans invented legal systems because killing each other was inefficient, but also because humans discovered a truth that terrified every civilization that ever learned it too late. If you don't give people justice, they create their own. And when Mara said that, she wasn't threatening the court, she was warning it. The Concord heard the difference between a tantrum and a forecast. In a private ethics chamber that night, High Arbiter Kazori Ven and Clerk Saul Vai demanded explanation from Dr. Lena Harrow, humanity's psychological envoy, and Lena sat with hands folded, calm as a surgeon, and told them the thing the Concord couldn't quite name. Humans don't fear punishment the way the galaxy does. Humans fear unfairness. And a human will accept prison if they believe they deserve it, but if they believe the system is wrong, they will burn it down even if they lose, because humans don't worship law. Humans worship story, and story is the weapon that outlives any verdict. Kazori Ven tried to say the court's intention was not to value property above life, and Lena's eyes cooled as she replied that humans didn't care about intent, only impact, because intent can be lied about, but impact is what stays in the body. And then she gave him the psychological dagger. If the Concord convicted Jonah Red, he would become a symbol, and symbols are how humans turn suffering into movements, and movements are how civilizations get rewritten. The final session brought representatives from dozens of worlds into silent observation, because the Concord understood something was happening that couldn't be contained inside one case file. If they convicted Jonah, they preserved precedent, but invited rebellion from every species that had ever been crushed by precedent. If they acquitted him, they admitted their machine could hesitate, and if the machine could hesitate, it could be questioned, and if it could be questioned, it could be changed. Jonah stood still in the ring, exhausted,
fists clenched, while Mara stood beside him with the calm of someone who already knew the shape of the outcome she'd engineered. And Kazori Ven rose to issue the verdict with a voice that carried something new, something like awareness, maybe even dread, as he recited the facts, then acknowledged the unregistered cryopods, then acknowledged the rejected rescue transmission, and then spoke the sentence that mattered more than guilty or not guilty. The tribunal acknowledges precedent does not cover this scenario. And the Pillar Court, the ancient spine of galactic order, openly admitted it had encountered a moment it could not neatly categorize. Naru protested that inconsistency would destabilize the legal lattice, and Mara's eyes flashed because she wanted the court to hear that word, destabilize, and feel what humans felt when confronted with a system that could harm innocence while claiming perfection. Yes, she said, that's the point. And Kazori then hesitated, and in that hesitation, Mara recognized fear not of humans, but of the ripple effect of mercy, because mercy is contagious. And then the High Arbiter declared Jonah Red not guilty, and the courtroom did not erupt, but the galaxy changed anyway, because the Concord had done something more dangerous than altering a sentence. It had admitted that law could fail. And once you admit failure, you invite improvement, and improvement is the first step toward revolution in a civilization built on stillness.
After the verdict, Ambassador Elias Rourke met Mara in a corridor that smelled faintly of ozone and old circuitry, and Rourke didn't congratulate her because he wasn't naive enough to think this was just victory, telling her she'd shaken the foundation of galactic law, and that every species that had ever felt crushed under Concord precedent would now point to Jonah's case as proof that the system could bend. And Mara didn't deny it, because she hadn't walked into the Pillar Court to win one man's freedom and then go home. She had come to plant a seed in the court's own archive, a legal parasite that would grow whenever anyone searched for salvage interference and found instead the first human precedent of rescue priority, ambiguity, and the court's willingness to weigh life against property. "You planned that," Rourke said, and Mara's smile was small and sharp as she replied that human lawyers don't fight battles, they fight precedent. And you don't change a galaxy by winning wars, you change it by rewriting what it thinks is normal. And the months that followed proved her foresight wasn't optimism, it was calculation. Petitions poured in from species that had never dared challenge the Concord, demanding representation rights, procedural safeguards, appeals, and, most terrifying to the old system, the presumption of innocence, while others demanded trial by peers and even jury systems, and the Concord found itself faced with a legal storm it couldn't jail, because it wasn't one criminal, it was a concept spreading, and concepts don't fit in cells. Naru tried to rally the old advocates, calling the human influence a contamination, but every time he spoke, another world remembered its own victims who had been erased by paperwork, and Jonah Red's case became shorthand for a new fear and a new hope, that the Concord's law might be powerful, but it wasn't sacred. High Arbiter Kazori Ven, who had built his identity on the certainty of the system, found that certainty turning into a quiet internal pressure that wouldn't go away, the psychological weight of having seen his own rescue protocol deny living beings because they weren't documented. And late one cycle, he stood alone in the Pillar Court, reviewing the archive data, the moment of rejection, unregistered life-form cargo, claim conflict, looping like a bruise in his mind, and Sol Veer approached to report unrest across the Concord, asking if the ruling had been correct, and Kazori Ven admitted the truth no Concord judge was trained to say, "I do not know." And when Sol asked why he ruled as he did if he wasn't certain, Kazori Ven answered in a voice that sounded like a crack in stone, because if law does not serve life, then law is only a weapon.
And that sentence, spoken quietly in an empty court, mattered more than any public broadcast, because it meant the Concord's highest legal authority had begun to internalize the human heresy that justice was not the protection of statutes, it was the protection of beings. And when the Concord later demanded the essence of human justice from Rourke and Lena, Rourke told them humanity's definition of justice rested on a terrifying premise, that power must justify itself, while Lena explained that humans assumed the state was dangerous until proven otherwise, not because humans were naturally distrustful, but because humans had been trained by their own history to recognize that systems drift, that institutions rot, that the powerful rewrite rules when no one is watching, and humans, with all their contradictions, had become the ones who show up when it happens, not with purity, not with perfection, but with relentless questioning and the willingness to accept ambiguity in exchange for fairness.
Years later, the Pillar Court was no longer pristine in the way it once was, not because its crystal had cracked, but because its aura of inevitability had been punctured. New trials began with procedure where once there had been automation. New advocates argued meaning where once there had been only matching. And when another non-human defendant stood in the defense ring demanding counsel, a human lawyer stepped forward. Different face, same predator confidence, and Kzori then watched the room accept it, watched the clerks log objections, watched the prosecution forced to prove rather than declare, and he understood what humanity had truly delivered to the galaxy. Not a set of laws, but a mindset, the refusal to let a system claim moral authority without scrutiny. The insistence that when a rule produces an atrocity, the rule is what should be questioned, not the person who refused to obey it. And that mindset moved like a tide through the Concord, rewriting normal from the inside. Jonah Red, who had wanted only to save strangers from dying in frozen darkness, became the accidental spark. Mara Voss became the deliberate flame. Elias Rourke became the diplomat who let the fire through the door, and Dr. Lena Harrow became the calm voice explaining to a frightened galaxy that humans were not uniquely righteous, merely uniquely unwilling to accept that justice could be outsourced to machines, because humans had tried outsourcing responsibility before, to kings, to laws, to algorithms, to gods, and every time, eventually, someone paid the price. So humanity arrived in the Concord carrying an old, brutal wisdom wrapped in courtroom language. The system itself can be judged, and once that idea exists, no legal empire remains untouched, because a civilization that learns to doubt begins to change, and a civilization that begins to change can never again pretend it was perfect.